The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we look at how new science and new challenges are pushing us to think differently about the role of bacteria in healthcare and pest control in agriculture. Hello and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. With me is Ed Yong, an award-winning science writer who reports for The Atlantic. His work has also appeared in National Geographic, Wired, The New York Times, Nature, Scientific American, among many others. He is the author of the best-selling book, I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us and a Grander View of Life. Ed, it's always great to have you back.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
So your book is all about microbes and microbiomes, but what I want to just talk about first is the changing kind of wider perception of microbes and bacteria. Up until fairly recently, bacteria pretty much always played the villain's part.
Yeah, that's right. That's one of the great themes in the book, that these things have been misunderstood and neglected for a very long time. And I think that dates back to some of the earliest days in microbiology. When they were first discovered, no one really knew whether they were anything important, so they were kind of neglected and ignored. And then in very quick succession, people realized that they were actually responsible for many of the most infamous diseases that have afflicted humanity for many centuries. So things like plague and typhoid and cholera, tuberculosis, and very, very, very quickly, within a few years of each other, scientists realized that germs were responsible for these diseases. So they forever became known as villains, as things that we needed to destroy unless they were going to destroy us first. And so that idea still permeates our culture today. We think of microbes, of bacteria, as germs. We think that they cause disease. We think that they are signs of dirt and decay. If we find bacteria on our surfaces, like on my phone or on the computer that I'm using, or on like the doorknob of on a doorknob or a handrail or anything like that, we think that those surfaces are therefore dirty. So they do have a very negative perception. They have somewhat of a PR problem.
That is starting to change, though, with some of the research that come up. So now we're starting to get more of this idea that microbes and bacteria, or at least some bacteria, is good. Right. Yeah.
Obviously, there are microbes that cause diseases, and they are a very important threat, but they are also by far away in the minority. The vast majority of microbes are at worst benign and at best actually beneficial to us. So we're starting to realize that all animals live in symbiosis with vast communities of microbes that live in their guts or in their skins or just all around and inside their bodies, and that these organisms play often a really important part in the lives of their hosts.
There's a line in the prologue of your book, actually, that I quite like and have shamelessly used when talking about microbiome to others, which is all zoology is really ecology.
Right,
which I really quite liked. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Totally. That was sort of one of the central lines of the book. It was there in like the book proposal I wrote. It was always there, like framing this idea from the start of my head. So, when we think about zoology, when we think about animals, we often think about individuals. That's the sort of animating concept. We focus on the lives of individuals, but really every single individual, whether you're talking about a cheetah or a hummingbird or a human, is an entire community. It lives its life together with all of these other organisms that are invisible but that are also very influential. And to get at that biology to understand what's going on, we need ecology, which is the science of communities in the natural world, the science of relationships. And I think that's really what we need to understand when we think about the animal world. If I go to a zoo and I look at the enclosure with, like, say, a bear in it, that bear isn't just one thing. It's an entire world. It's lots of different relationships and dependencies between that one organism and all the others that live in its body. And that's sort of the core of ecology. And that's why, all the things that we think of when we think of ecology, when we think of food webs or succession, where like one community of organisms replaces another, all of those principles apply to a single animal life.
This is this idea I really like, because it also speaks to how science likes to kind of pick out a thing and study that thing. So study a microbe or study a bear, but we can't sort of get the full picture of that thing unless we look at it in context or look at it and how it relates to the broader world around it. We miss pieces of that puzzle if we only look at the thing in isolation.
Totally. It's almost cliche now to accuse Western science of being a bit too reductionist, but it does apply here. We sort of were very, very good in modern biology at sort of, like you say, picking out particular parts and working out how those work in extreme detail. But those more relational sides to biology, where I think only now starting to get a proper handle on, not just like how to study them, but also why they're important.
Is there a key moment in this shift from science thinking about bacteria as individual things that cause disease only to being more about, or the shift to thinking more about a microbiome and these relationships? Is that a clear definition or a clear divide in science, or is this a very gray kind of slow process?
I think it's been a grey, slow process. It's certainly been very gradual. Loads of people have actually understood this principle quite early on. Even in the heady days of germ theory, people like Pasteur realized, well, he suspected, and slightly wrongly, but kind of almost on the right lines, that if you removed all the microbes from an organism, it would probably die. So I think he understood that we sort of depend on these to an extent. And over the centuries and decades, scientists have studied these things, but I don't think it's really permeated the popular consciousness for various reasons. But it's only really in the last, I would say, couple of decades, maybe 10 to 15 years, that it's really become mainstream. There've always been people working on this, but they're now at the sort of core, the center of biology. They're attracting attention and funding. And I think that's for two main reasons. One is technological. So we now have the tools that we need in order to study the microbial world properly. So rather than having to culture microbes in laboratories, which is difficult to do for like 99% of them, we can actually work out who is where by sequencing their DNA straight out of an environmental sample. So that's one thing. There's also been a cultural shift, I think, because of that technological advancement. Scientists who have been looking at these issues from very disparate fields, from things like gastroenterology or zoology or botany, have started working together and realizing that actually many of the same ecological principles underpin their work in lots of different organisms in different fields. And I think that's a kind of coming together, that cultural unity is also driven the sense of this is an important thing. I don't think there was the microbiome, before it became a sort of sexy buzzword, people were talking about the science of microbial ecology. But I think it only became this sort of thriving, abundant field in recent decades.
So it's always been there, but just recently it started to capture some of the spotlight.
Yeah, I would say that's right.
So I think probably most people now kind of have an understanding that most animals and plants live in some kind of symbiotic relationships with some of our microbes, or have some kind of relationship with our microbes. Mm-hmm. But I was really surprised just how many and varied these relationships are, and also how deeply, deeply important they can be, which I think I was quite surprised by.
Yeah. So they are very, very varied. You can get like humans, we have bacteria living inside our guts. On our skin, in our mouths. There are insects that have bacteria living inside their very cells, inside special organs that they've created to house those microbes. In terms of the relationships, there are, our microbes help us to digest our food, to train our immune system, to sculpt and shape our organs. Then you've got insects that have microbacteria that act as nutritional supplements that provide them with nutrients that are missing from their diets. There are deep sea worms and clams that have bacteria that provide them with all their nutrients, so that they have lost the ability to eat. They have lost their mouths and guts because they have bacteria to provide them with all they need. There are squid that use microbes to produce light. There are worms that have microbes that help them regenerate. There are all these incredible, fantastical abilities that animals only have because of their microbial partners.
And in many cases, this isn't a we live better with them. In some cases, it's actually a we can't do it on our own anymore.
Right, exactly. So, for example, those insects I told you about with the nutritional supplements, those are sap-sucking bugs. They're things like aphids and cicadas, leaf hoppers. If those insects did not have their bacteria, they would die. They wouldn't be able to get the nutrients that they need from their diet. And the corollary of that is that those insects would never have been able to tap into that food source without those bacteria in the first place. So those microbes allowed them to take up this evolutionary opportunity to radiate into this group that now numbers something like 85,000 species. They would never have been able to do that without those microbes. And some of them have these ridiculously complicated dependencies with their bacteria. They have microbes that help them to make important nutrients like amino acids, but it's a combination of genes from the host insect and the bacteria that work together to produce those amino acids. If without neither partner can do it all on their own, so they're completely intertwined at this biochemical level. Like if either one of them tried to live independently, they wouldn't be able to.
This is fascinating to me because I want to know how these dependencies first came into being. Like the aphid you just used as an example. Like, how did that relationship start? Because presumably it started as two separate creatures, and at some point they teamed up and became dependent upon each other over time. But have we been able to pinpoint where some of these relationships, especially these deep relationships, started?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think a critical issue for people in the field. Often these things are very difficult to study because they happened a long time ago, and their first, the first footsteps of that partnership, when the partners started walking together, have been lost in deep time. And often, the animals and the microbes now are very different to what they used to be. They have changed a lot. Their genomes are very different. But there are a few cases where you can look at what those partnerships were like originally. So there is this incredible story, I think, of a retired firefighter named Thomas Fritz, who was cutting down a tree near his property, and he slipped and he impaled his hand with a branch. And that wound became infected, and some doctors took samples from the wound and sent it off to some labs for testing. And it had a bacterium inside it that seemed to be a perfect match for another thing called Sodalis, which lives inside insects. Now, Sodalis is not a free-living bacterium. It can't infect wounds. It's got this kind of weird, tiny, shrunken, degenerate genome. But this other microbe that was found in the hand of the firefighter turns out to be like kind of a wild Sodalis, like what this bacterium would have been like before it became this inextricable part of an insect host. And so from that, we can look at the sort of things that allow these partnerships to form in the first place. And I think it's probably the case that a lot of these things happen by accident. These are microbes that are there in the environment. They get taken up somehow into the body of an animal. Maybe they're swallowed in a meal, or through an injury, or maybe they're transferred by a parasite or a predator or something like that. And then they stay there. Somehow they have the right tools, the right genetic qualities to set up a lasting infection in their host. And maybe these partnerships are very different when they start off. Maybe they are something more akin to a chronic infection, and then over time become more benign and then eventually beneficial.
So how similar are individual humans or cats or elephants' microbiomes from others of the same species? I mean, I guess the question I want to ask is, how similar would my microbiome be to yours?
Right. I think there are substantial variations there. We vary much more in terms of the microbes we carry than in the genes we share. And the weird thing, I think, is that we understand some of the things that affect those differences. We know that our diet matters, probably the way we're born, the way we grow up, our genes, our immune systems, the medicines we take. All of these things can influence which microbes call us home. But if we look at very large studies, we look at the largest studies of the microbiome that have been published so far, they can only explain a very small proportion of that variation, so maybe something like 10%. So we're still largely in the dark about what makes my microbiome different to yours or that of any of our listeners. And I think that just goes to show how early on we are in this science.
So even though there's a lot of ads on the internet that seem to know what a healthy or normal human microbiome looks like, we don't really know yet.
That's right. I mean, don't believe the hype for sure. This is not a predictive science by any means. You can send your poop off for sequencing, and they will tell you what microbes are living inside your gut. But you cannot tell from looking at that whether you are healthy, what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, what you should eat, or what you should change about your lifestyle in order to influence the microbes inside you. At the moment, this is still very much a descriptive science. It's still not one that's actually predictive.
Yeah, I mean, definitely if somebody kind of pays attention to science news, they'll probably find mentions of the microbiome everywhere. And you might definitely think that sometimes these incredible headlines that come out of these areas of science seem like microbes are allowing us to cure almost everything, like complex, difficult things like obesity and cancer. And
right.
It definitely starts to sound a bit like a cure-all that maybe we'll be in time exposed to, or in time we'll find that that's, we've gone down the wrong path. Some of the headlines are extraordinarily hyperbolic.
I agree. I think hype has run truly amok in this field, and I think it hurts the research a lot. The microbiome has been linked to pretty much every in a condition, an illness under the sun. And most of this comes from very small, underpowered, somewhat weak correlative studies where you take small numbers of people and or animals, compare healthy and sick individuals, and then look at changes in their microbiome. And, you can't tell from that whether those changes are a cause or a consequence of those conditions. And even in cases where you sort of nudge at causality, where you can do experiments, for example, where you treat with animals with antibiotics and you see if the loss of those microbes has an influence on their condition, or you can do transplants where you move microbes from one animal to another and you see symptoms of conditions moving across. Now that hints at causality, but it doesn't say like whether the microbes are initiating or exacerbating a condition. It doesn't say like whether any kind of causal influence of those microbes matters in the long run. So, here's a very, very overhyped example that irks me somewhat. So there are studies with mice showing that if you treat with antibiotics at an early age, you change the microbiome and you increase the risk that those rodents will put on weight later on. And this is obviously turned into headlines that scream antibiotics are making us fat. Maybe antibiotics as that we're taking as kids are fueling the obesity epidemic. Well, in those studies, the increase in body fat in these animals was very small, like on the order of 10%, maybe 20% at the absolute maximum. And, that's not a huge amount. That's like me putting on maybe like 14, 15 pounds. Like I would rather I wasn't 15 pounds heavier, but it's not going to suddenly tip me into this, into the edge of becoming obese. And I think that's what matters. This field is very good at finding statistically significant effects, but not that great yet at finding actually significant effects or working out whether what it's showing is actually relevant to us in our daily lives, much less like the explanation or the cure-all for all of these conditions, all of these 20th century plagues. And I think I think that the microbiome may well turn out to be important. I think that these microbes play such an influential role in our lives. I'm perfectly willing to accept that they could be important, but we need to still show that. And there is a massive tendency to just assume that any change in the microbiome in the context of illness must be a bad thing. So, scientists talk about this word dysbiosis, which means that the community as a whole has turned into this negative state that influences our health in a bad way. And I think that the idea is very sound. I think it's again this ecological idea that rather than having like a germ that causes a disease, you have an entire community that's gone rogue. Fine. But the term is thrown around with reckless abandon. So, if you look at a microbiome if you look at what happens to the microbiome after a dose of antibiotics and you see changes, it's so common for people to say, oh, well, that's dysbiosis. But you haven't actually shown that the changes are bad. You've just assumed that they're bad. And likewise, you can look at, say, the microbiome. I'm just going to pick a random disease. Let's say like multiple sclerosis. You look at the microbiome of someone with multiple sclerosis. You find differences in which bacteria they have compared to someone who's healthy. And you say, aha, we have found dysbiosis here, and maybe those changes in those microbes are making that person ill. But that's a complete tautology. Like you've assumed it's dysbiosis because that person is sick. And then you're saying that they're sick because they have dysbiosis. It's kind of this ridiculous logical loop, but it happens so often in studies in this field.
It's one of these complications when we can't look at something in a really reductive way and we have to take the larger relationships and look at a community of things, as it becomes much more complicated and much more chaotic and much more difficult to tease out causation.
Yeah. And I think I think actually part of it is the fact that so much of the study of the human microbiome in particular doesn't come from people with an ecological background. It comes from people with a clinical background. And I think they are very used to studying things in quite a reductive way. So, a lot of medicine involves this quite basic arithmetic. You either lack something like a vitamin, so you put that thing back in and you're better, or you have something you shouldn't have, like a virus, so you take that thing out and you're better. So it's always trying to find that component that you either add or subtract. And that's sort of what's happened with microbiome studies. So you compare people who are healthy and sick, you find like which microbes are lacking or which microbes are more abundant in the sick person, and then you think, okay, you either take those out or you put them back in, and then you're better. And actually, it's almost certainly going to be more complicated than that. The microbes within us that might influence our health will do so in the context of all the other microbes that live with us, in the context of our genes, our immune systems, the food we eat. So there's a lot of complexity here, and I think we're only starting to grapple with it both technically and conceptually.
So how do we actually take a closer look at people's microbiome? I mean, is looking at what comes out of us the best way to do it, or are we missing some of the picture?
Yeah, so it's hard, right? When we look at, say, the gut microbiome, you're looking at stool samples. Now, the gut is an incredibly long tube. The microbes within it vary from one part to the other. They vary, into the tube as well. So from, just from the matter of like a millimeter or so across the intestine in any direction, the community of microbes we have can change. So I think we need to better understanding of like who is where, and like the geography of that. So how the microbiome varies in different parts of the gut or the mouth or the skin. How those microbes interact with each other, with us. We need to just get more savvy about understanding how those organisms are connected to each other and to us, rather than just saying like, okay, who is there? Let's just do like a very broad census.
It seems to me like there's definitely a focus on human health when we talk about the microbiome, certainly when we're talking about the microbiome with the general public. And this focus on what we can do to improve it, to improve our health, how we can approach it when we're having poor health and whether or not that's related to our microbiome. And as we get more information, it strikes me that doctors will start to need to treat patients and their microbiome, but that seems like a lot for one profession, the doctor's profession, to know, and lots of variables for them to take into account. I'm just sort of wondering, is it feasible for doctors to take on this entirely new field as part of their profession for dealing with health? Or maybe should we be looking at some new kind of profession to rise up to work with medical doctors to help on the microbiome side?
Oh, that's a good question. I think doctors will just have to get more savvy about this. It's part of the revolution in 21st century medicine that touches on things like genetics. I just think this is going to be a part of what medicine is in the future. If you go to a doctor, you may get your microbiome sampled, and they may need to have to tailor your treatments based on which microbes you have. They'll need to be able to talk to you about that. I think that it's just part of what medicine is going to turn into.
It's interesting as well, because while the general public is starting to learn more about this, I think doctors in the health profession is also starting to grapple with some of their policies and procedures that have been in place for a long time, like sterilizing everything in a hospital, which it turns out may not actually be the best way to go.
Yeah, I think so too. I think one needs to. So the idea here is that if you try and sterilize the surface, for a start, like, you can't really do it. Like, there are just microbes everywhere. They get onto everything. Like, I am sitting here bleeding microbes into the world around me at the moment. So,
what an attractive picture, Ed.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a bit like pig pen, right? Like, I feel like it's like miasma of microbes around me. So part of the just being in spaces where humans exist, there are going to be microbes. So if you remove microbes from a surface, you might create vacancies where things that we don't want to be there, like the ones that actually do cause disease, can take up hold. So we need to get very savvy, I think, about our relationship to the microbial world and how our indoor architecture affects that. And that matters for hospitals because that's obviously a key interface where the microbes that are present are in a position to influence the health of lots of patients, where, we practice sterility a lot, but I think it's an open question about whether those practices are making things better or worse. Now, obviously you don't want to go too far and say you shouldn't bother sterilizing anything. Like, if I'm going to hospital for an operation and someone is going to stick instruments inside my body, I want those things to be sterilized. That's not going to change. But what might change is, how our attitudes to rooms and surfaces. Like, for simple things like, do you open a window in a hospital? I think actually you should do. You want environmental microbes to come into those surfaces rather than just having rooms where you're kind of stewing in the microbes of people who are sick and are bleeding their microbes into that space.
It seems counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people to think that you want your nurse to have washed their hands, but you also want your hospital window to be open. Those seem like conflicting ideas.
Totally. And I think it's a very counterintuitive thing. We still want to, of course, test that all these ideas are true. And I think we're sort of some way towards that, but not fully yet. But you're right. I think that comes up against some of the problems that we talked about at the very start of this chat, that we just have this deep cultural idea of microbes being a problem. So it's very hard to think about steps that would encourage the presence of microbes in the world around us, as things that we wanted to do to improve our health. It just it hits up against this deep-seated cultural notion of these things as bad.
This bumps up, of course, against the hygiene hypothesis as well, which is this idea that things sometimes shouldn't be too clean, that we need to have exposure to microbes and to bacteria, both because some of them are beneficial to us, because in order to function in the world and work well in our ecosystem, we need those relationships, but also because it helps to build our immune system so that we can recognize the properly bad stuff when it comes into us and our system's ready to push it out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a lot of growing evidence for the hygiene hypothesis. So this is the idea that as you say, that we need exposure to microbes at an early age, like a wide range of them, in order to properly educate our immune system about what's out there in the environment. And if we don't get that education, we end up with this hyperactive immune system that is more likely to overact against benign threats, which explains things like allergies, autoimmune diseases, you name it. So I think there's a lot of value to this idea, and certainly the microbiome, the science of the microbiome has put a lot of has generated a lot of supporting evidence for this, and I think it speaks to this idea that things like dirt are not necessarily a bad thing for us, and maybe we have gone overboard in our attempts to sanitize and sterilize the world around us.
One of the areas of high interest when we're talking about the microbiome, especially when it comes to ideas of our immune system, is with babies, both in how they get their microbiome and how their health is impacted over the short and long term if their microbiome doesn't get populated correctly. So what do we know about how we pass on our adult microbiome to our babies?
So, yeah, I think this is I'm glad you asked this, because there's a lot of this is another area where I think there's a fair bit of hype. So there's Normally, the womb is a sterile environment, and when babies are born, they receive their first microbes from their mother's vaginal tract, and those become the first colonists that take up shop, and then that then create the sort of starter communities for the babies. Now, if a baby is born through C-section, it gets those starter microbes from mother's skin or from the hospital environment rather than from her vagina, and because of that, some people have suggested that those initial differences could set the babies up for different communities of microbes as they grow up, which might lead to poorer health, like maybe their immune system doesn't get the right education early on. Maybe they then maybe they have a higher risk of obesity or asthma or all sorts of other things. Now, the problem with that idea is if you look at adults who were born through either C-sections or vaginal deliveries, you can't see any differences in their microbiomes anymore, and that's also the case for older babies, for very young children. So clearly, those initial differences normalize; they disappear after some time. And the important question then is whether those differences, to the extent that they exist initially, whether those have lasting repercussions for a child's health. I still think we don't know the answer to that question, but there's a lot of talk out there in the media as if we actually do, as if this was a very well-established risk factor for poorer health later on. And I think that's a case of the rhetoric around the microbiome jumping too far ahead of what the actual science has shown.
And I think it's also an example of where certain factions of people who already have beliefs around vaginal births versus C-section births kind of glom onto a headline or a little bit of science in a paper that they may have read or not read, maybe just heard about, and use that as part of their political rhetoric.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. I've seen that in some interviews, in some of the Q&As I've had after a talk. I think, sadly, people are all too keen to tell women what to do with their bodies and with their reproductive choices. The microbiome just becomes yet another tool for doing that. And I think we just need to be very careful here. I think we need to base if there are concerns that these sorts of things could influence a baby's health later on, fine. We need to test that, and it's totally legit to portray that as a hypothesis that we're testing. But I think there's a big difference between doing that and say C-sections are harming your babies because of their microbes.
Ed, thank you so much. Really fascinating book with so much information in it and so many great examples of, like I said, science fiction-like relationships that are happening in the world right now, which is really cool.
Thanks, Rochelle. Really good to talk to you. Thanks for having me on again.
And if you want to learn more about Ed Yong, his writing, or his book, I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us, and a Grander View of Life, we, of course, have links to get you started on our website, which you'll find at scienceforthepeople.ca.
Every week on Science for the People, we take the latest in scientific progress and relate it to people, our friends, our families, our communities, and our society. And we give researchers, authors, and journalists the time to talk in depth about what matters to them. If you love science but aren't satisfied with sound bites, join us again next week for Science for the People on your local radio station or anytime online at scienceforthepeople.ca.
You're listening to Science for the People. I'm your host, Rochelle Saunders. With me is Emily Monosson, an environmental toxicologist and writer. She is an independent scholar at the Ronan Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's the editor of Motherhood, The Elephant in the Laboratory, and is the author of 3 books, including her most recent, Natural Defense, Enlisting Bugs and Germs to Protect Our Food and Health. Emily, welcome to Science for the People.
Hi, Rochelle. Thank you for having me.
So this book is interesting, mostly because you look at some of the newest science in microbiology and some of the challenges in health and agriculture, but you kind of look at them together, which is something we don't often see. Typically, any book that deals with some of the new stuff about microbiology is focused more on the microbiome and is really focused on health. So why bring the two topics, medicine and agriculture, together in one book?
Because I think when we're thinking about some of these sort of non-traditional or alternative, I don't really want to call them alternative, but different kinds of solutions other than using the traditional kinds of chemicals that we've used, like antibiotics and pesticides, a lot of the solutions in new strategies, or some of these are old strategies becoming new again, are really similar because particularly if we're thinking this wasn't just focused on microbes, so I go into sort of pests and pathogens, or pathogens and pests. But when we do start off thinking about microbes and bacteria and pathogens, a lot of the solutions, whether we're thinking about human health or agricultural health, are similar, starting with sort of our realization of the importance of the microbiome, as you mentioned. So in human health, we're all now very aware of the human microbiome and the importance, and that we don't want to wipe out the microbiome when we're trying to target a particular pathogen. And it's very similar in agriculture as well, that the soil microbiome, or the rhizobiome, or whatever you want to call it, rhizosphere zoo, some people call it, all the different bacteria that are in the root zone, is very important for maintaining health of plants and crops. And so this is something that I think some growers know, and probably a lot of growers know maybe intuitively, or know that in organic in particular. But it's something that in conventional farming has been kind of forgotten with all of our dependence on a lot of the sort of chemical agriculture. And so I think people are starting to come back to this, thinking about the importance of the sort of microbial ecology. And so whether you're thinking about microbial ecology in human systems, in our bodies, or in agricultural systems, it's a similar kind of thing.
We hear a lot about how bacterial ecology, and in particular the microbiome, is going to change medicine or is already changing medicines. I mean, there is headlines about those kinds of topics all the time. But why aren't we hearing as much about how the same kind of change in understanding of bacterial ecology might be able to change agriculture?
So, first of all, I'm newer to agriculture, so I was thinking, I think this is really cool, and I'm thinking, but this must be known. This is like, who doesn't know that soil microbes are important? People compost, but like I said, I think that's something that's taken into consideration with sort of organic growers know that, and sort of people who are into more sustainable growing. But with conventional agriculture, it's something that I guess has sort of been forgotten. And it's something that there are books, and I think you spoke to someone, David Montgomery, about The Hidden Half of Nature, maybe, and talking about the importance of soil microbes and things like agriculture. And I don't know how that came to be. I think it's just the way sort of conventional and industrial agriculture emerged over the last sort of 50 or 60 years. But now there's a scientist from USDA who goes around showing conventional growers the importance of a healthy soil microbiome. And when he does sort of visual demonstrations, I think it becomes very clear how important it is to think about soil health in terms of the living organisms in soil, not just nutrients and that sort of thing. So I think it's something that is just coming back in part because I think we're all more aware that we want to reduce our reliance on chemicals. I would guess that even conventional growers, if they didn't have to rely on chemicals, they wouldn't. So anything that can help reduce that, and if that means creating a healthier soil, and it's better to prevent runoff and all sorts of things, then, that's a better way to go. But, how do you do that? And so there are people now who are sort of going back to large scale growers and trying to get them to think about soil health. And there was just a whole issue in one of the Journal of Ecology, I think it was, or some journal, about sort of sustainable agriculture and the importance of microbes in the soil and thinking about sort of the soil microbiome. So I think there's a lot of excitement around this now. And another thing that probably contributed to this is, so in the book I talked about the sort of technological advances in things like DNA analysis, and that combined with computing power have enabled scientists to do more genomics work and sort of understand how many microbes and who's in the soil and what kind of microbes and what their services are and all sorts of their function. And so we're understanding so much more about what we couldn't really understand before. You know, before when people were studying microbes, it's really what you could culture in the lab. And that's the same thing with humans as well, right? We understood what we could culture in the lab, and that's just a small fraction of what's out there. And so now there's this explosion in understanding that there's just millions of different microbes, and, you know, they all have different functions and roles, and they work together in their complex communities. And so I think now that there's this understanding, maybe it's sort of made more visual. People are maybe paying more attention to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it probably helps with healthcare topics that health is for everybody more of an immediate concern. We're so divorced and kind of separated from our food process here in the West that it just is probably not as sexy a headline.
Well, yeah, that's true too. And so, but I think that the two together, there's some synergy.
One of the parallels that you draw that I definitely hadn't thought of in agriculture was the idea how an antibiotic such as penicillin, when we take it, it tends to wipe out all of like our gut bacteria, the good and the bad, kind of indiscriminately. And this whole idea of having good bacteria, helpful bacteria in medicine is really something we're starting to think more carefully about. And you definitely in the book draw that parallel to agriculture with the idea of pesticides, how quite often our use of pesticides very much is like a wholesale antibiotic. It will wipe out everything, including a lot of the time some of the good bacteria that really we want to keep in place because it's helpful to the plants we're trying to grow.
Right. So the story that I write about in the book that most is in alignment with that idea is the story of the strawberry growers in California, which I thought was just kind of fascinating to me as a toxicologist, in part because what they had been doing in California is using methylbromide, which is a fumigant, to sort of basically fumigate the soil before planting strawberries and basically sterilizing the top layer of the soil. So, you know, broad spectrum, kill everything. But what happened is that's an ozone destroying chemical. And so it was supposed to be phased out according to the Montreal Protocol, which it was, but because strawberry growers really wanted that chemical and felt they needed it, it wasn't phased out in California until just last year. And that was really a go-to chemical, and it controlled particular diseases. And so what that left them with was scrambling for a better way. And so some of the scientists I spoke to are scientists who are really trying to think about the soil microbiome and think about how can we encourage beneficial bacteria that can help suppress disease. So they're trying to create or encourage what they call disease suppressive soils. And these are soils that contain sort of microbial community that will discourage disease and sort of fend off some of the pathogens, and at the same time sort of encourage or provide nutrients to the plants, and so sort of create a better situation for the plants. And so it's really creating what the equivalent of sort of a healthy microbiome for the plants.
Pesticides are interesting, and there's a couple of crops in particular that I'd love for you to talk about, because some of them I didn't know we were really reliant on pesticides to the extent that we are. And one of the examples you use in the book is apples, and why we don't see a lot of organic apples out there, and how difficult it is to grow apples without pesticides.
Yeah, so that was something that was, interesting to me, and I hadn't realized until I started looking into this. So it's actually mostly in the East Coast. It's hard for for growers to grow organic apples. I think it's not as hard in other places, which is where, for those of us in the East Coast, which is where I am, a lot of our organic apples are coming from other places. But in the East Coast, there are a lot of pests and pathogens that attack our apples. And so I spoke to some cooperative extension folks at the University of Massachusetts, and who are working with growers to use insect pheromones. And so and that is so people have probably heard about pheromones, because you can go online and get human pheromones if you want to attract a mate. I don't know how well they work in humans, but it's the same idea. So you have pheromones that attract, insects send out pheromones or chemical scents to attract mates. And so what they can do now, and they've been doing this for a long time, but I think the interest is growing, is to, in apple orchards, they've been using, one of their pests is called the codling moth. And so that is an insect that will lay its eggs once it mates. It lays its eggs on the apples, and then the little larvae burrow into their apples, and you get your wormy apple. And so codling moths use scent to attract their mates, and orchardists can now release these scents into the orchard. And when there's so much scent, the thought is that the male moths can't find their mates because they're just confused. There's just too much scent instead of zeroing in on a mate. So it's called mating disruption with pheromones. And it's been really effective in some of these orchards, where they've been able to, in some cases, reduce the amount of pesticides they use by 75% or more for the codling moth control. That doesn't mean that they can't control everything, obviously, with that. But it's true, I belong to an organic CSA here in Massachusetts, but they use IPM or integrated pest management apples because it's so hard to get organic apples here.
That does seem to be a reoccurring challenge with the idea of moving away from what we think of as traditional pesticide. And a traditional pesticide model is you have to be more targeted, and quite often you can't just wholesale replace one technique with another. Like, we're kind of used to replacing one pesticide with another. It's more about changing the idea of what pest control means and not sort of looking for that next kind of miracle easy button.
That is so true. So I think there's a lot of thinking, and especially when thinking about sort of evolution, because people, like I said, evolution happens, and, I've been on sort of some Twitter boards and other things where, you can say, well, here's a new solution, and someone will say, yeah, but, the pest will evolve to that too. And that's true. So it really takes a total rethinking of the whole system and what you're trying to do. And so, one thought is there sort of some level of whether it's a pest or a pathogen that can be allowed to sort of, to let either the body or the plant or whatever fend off itself. So you don't try to hammer these things out of existence, because that clearly hasn't worked. And so to take a more ecological approach and to think about it that way, and to sort of think about how you could manage something rather than try to necessarily eradicate it.
So when we talk about current pesticide usage, you mentioned that some of these strategies don't work, or maybe don't work as well as we think we do, or we think they do. Certainly, I think if you ask most people, most kind of average, not involved in the agriculture industry people, they would say, well, pesticides seem to be working quite well. There's lots of food at my grocery store and it doesn't cost very much. So what types of challenges are we having with current use of pesticides? Maybe over and above pesticide resistance, or is that really the big one that we're looking at?
No, I don't think resistance is the only problem. I think there's a lot of pressure for reducing pesticides just from consumers, if that's what you're asking. So that's another challenge, is that people really are much more aware of pesticides that are in their foods and produce, and are demanding that growers use less. I think they probably do, I think if you were to ask a conventional grower, I think they really feel that these are useful products. And I'm not totally, when talking about this or writing about this book, and the, problems with overuse and over-reliance on things like pesticides and antibiotics, I have to say first of all, I'm not anti-antibiotics. I think they're really important. That's something I sometimes have to remind my mother, who's like, my daughter says you shouldn't use antibiotics. I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. And I think it's the same thing with pesticides. I think we need to rethink how we do it. Maybe if we don't rely on them, there are always going to be pests and pathogens, and some of them are going to be very difficult to control. And so there may be times when these things need to be used. And we have this sort of, our society, we tend to be all one thing or all the other thing, where, don't use any chemical, or we have to use all chemical. And there's, someplace in between where maybe we could just use less when we really need to, and try to manage them in a better way that isn't so reliant on these kinds of sort of, industrial age chemicals.
I do think your book does a really good job of trying to walk that line, which so many books, especially when talking about agriculture and pest control and pesticides, where you have to find that space between trying to find alternative methods that people want and that are probably better for the environment and probably more sustainable, but also don't start to kind of fall into those tropes of chemical phobia that we sometimes see popping up in the media. And that's such a hard line to walk.
It is. So when I thought about doing this book, the human side was easy. That's pretty clear. But the agricultural side is definitely, and I also wrote about vaccines, which is another one of those areas where there's some, well, there probably shouldn't be controversy, but there seems like there is. But that gray area, I'm like, when you're trying to sell a book, my concern is that's not going to, it makes it difficult because there's probably a reason why the books that sell are either, we need to go all organic or we need to, we need these kinds of products or pesticides or whatever. So yeah, I think that it's hard to be in that gray area, but I think it's really important. I mean, it applies to a lot of things that we do. But, there's, I would prefer not to have any fruits or vegetables with pesticides in them or that I'm sure anybody would like to do that. And so would a grower. But the fact is, like I said, food is really hard to grow. And, there's some papers I've seen where they've made a distinction between sustainable and organic even. And I don't want to go there because I don't know enough about that area. But, there is, when I talk to the strawberry ag extension people, they said, when growers need to do organic, they need more space to grow them, to grow the crops. It takes more land. And, it's more expensive to do that too. So, which we pay for.
One of the other really fascinating parallels that you wrote about in the book between medicine and agriculture that I think is really, I hadn't really thought that carefully about it until reading these chapters, was about how identification and diagnosis, both for people, for health, and for agricultural diseases and pests, is a major problem. And it's something that really hasn't changed very much. We're still mostly diagnosing disease in the same way we used to. We're mostly diagnosing agricultural problems in the same way we used to.
Yeah, so that was something that was really surprising to me, was to ask physicians sort of how do they diagnose when somebody comes into an ER, how do they diagnose a disease? And it turns out that they're still culturing. There are a lot of rapid tests. You can walk in and get a strep test. My daughter's done it millions of times. You have a sore throat, they'll give you a rapid test. But there's very few of those kinds of rapid tests, and you're looking for something that you think might be there. And so, so for a diagnostician to just be able to tell whatever it is you have without having some inkling or having a rapid test available doesn't yet really exist. But there are ways now with sort of the genomics revolution to do really rapid diagnosis of any disease, say in a blood sample or a urine sample. And so these are things that aren't, they're more in the experimental and the research realm right now. But I think, there's some hope that they'll come into the medical realm and into the agricultural realm. So if you could quickly take, so one of the things, I wrote about some strategies, to sort of reduce chemical use. But of course, the flip side of that is prevention and, of disease and rapid diagnosis. Because if you could, get to, solving a problem quicker, it's less of a problem to solve, right? So if you can diagnose something quickly, that's better. So there's rapid DNA analysis that is coming, I think soon, both to the farm and to hospitals. But there's also this really cool, I thought, and you might know more about this, but methods to diagnose disease, which is using machine learning and based on apps. And so taking, say, the goal, I wrote about a couple of researchers who are developing a phone app for diagnosis of plant disease, so plant pathogens, where a grower could just snap a picture of a spot or whatever is infecting their leaf and get a diagnosis for that within minutes. I mean, this is their hope. It isn't quite there yet, but they're developing this. And so, to think about that, you could just snap a picture and get a diagnosis in seconds or minutes is really pretty incredible. And so that's something they're developing, part of it is called Plant Village. But, you know, if you think about that, I'm like, well, why couldn't they do that for something like skin cancer? And sure enough, if you go into the literature, there are people now who are also developing machine learning apps where they can snap a picture of a spot or a speck on an arm and, you know, try to diagnose skin cancers.
Emily, thank you so much. It's a really interesting book that I definitely recommend people pick up because it made me think about agriculture in a different way, and using, for me, the hook of medicine to sort of create these parallels was really useful because I had heard about a lot of the stuff in medicine, and to think about how the same kinds of structures or ideas can apply in agriculture really makes you think about it in a different way.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a really kind of fun time to talk about this. So thank you, Rochelle.
And if you want to learn more about Emily Monosson or her book, or any of her books, we will have links to get you started, which you can find in the show notes for this episode on our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.